My dear friends, if you have walked with me through these years, you know that my life as a priest, especially in the quieter moments between baptisms and funerals, confessions and homilies, has been a tapestry woven with threads of the ordinary and the extraordinary. We often speak of God's presence in the grand gestures, in the turning tides of history, but I have found him most profoundly in the intimate, raw spaces of human suffering and joy. And sometimes, just sometimes, he pulls back the veil in ways that leave us breathless, utterly undone by his love, reminding us that his kingdom is not bound by the confines of our reason, or indeed by the grim pronouncements of this world. I remember that particular night as if it were only yesterday, though a decade and more has passed since then. The rectory had settled into its evening quiet, a familiar, comforting hush that always descends after Compline, that final prayer of the day. The last light of a weary autumn sun had long since bled from the sky, leaving behind a canvas of deep, inky blue, dusted with the first shy stars. The air, crisp and carrying the faint earthy scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, seeped through the ancient windows of my study. I had just closed my breviary, the leather warm beneath my fingers, and was contemplating the passage from Psalm 91 that speaks of dwelling in the shelter of the Most High, a truth that often feels most potent when the world outside has hushed itself to sleep. The rhythm of the day had unwound, leaving me in that blessed space of contemplative peace, ready to surrender to the night. Then, the telephone, with its shrill, insistent demand, shattered the stillness. It was an abrupt, jarring sound in the quietude, one that always carries a premonition, especially for a priest. Emergencies rarely call during daylight hours. They often wait until the veil between worlds seems thinnest. I picked it up, my hand already sensing the weight of the news it might bring. "Father Michael?" The voice on the other end was Father Thomas, the hospital chaplain at St. Jude's Medical Center. His voice, usually steady and infused with a weary calm, was heavy tonight, laced with a fatigue that went beyond mere tiredness. It was the sound of a man carrying a burden too great, a voice I had learned to associate with the profound, soul-wrenching sorrow that only a hospital, especially its intensive care unit, can conjure. "Yes, Father Thomas. What is it?" I asked, my own heart beginning to quicken, already bracing for the impact. "Father, it's a little girl, 7 years old. Her name is Lily. She was brought in tonight. A sudden, catastrophic brain aneurysm. They're saying it's very bad." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp, piercing the quiet of my study. 7 years old. The innocent weight of that number fell upon me like a stone. 7. A child whose greatest worries should be scraped knees and bedtime stories, now caught in the terrifying embrace of a medical crisis so profound it could steal her very breath. A brain aneurysm. The words themselves are chilling, conjuring images of delicate, vital pathways suddenly ruptured, life leaking away, catastrophic. The chaplain didn't need to elaborate. The word itself was a complete sentence of despair. He continued, his voice softer now, as if whispering into a sacred space. "Her parents, Mark and Sarah, they're here. They're lost, Father. You know the look. That vacant, shell-shocked grief that turns the sterile, fluorescent-lit world of the ICU into an alien planet. They're just sitting, watching the machines, their world utterly undone." My mind immediately pictured them, two ordinary people, perhaps just hours ago discussing school projects or what to make for dinner, now plunged into a nightmare from which there seemed no waking. My heart ached for them already, an empathetic sorrow that is both a blessing and a burden of my calling. "The doctors," Father Thomas went on, a sigh escaping him, "they've been brutally honest. They've used words like inoperable and irreversible. They've given up hope, Father. Medically, there's nothing more they can do. It's just a matter of time. Inoperable, irreversible. These were not just clinical terms. They were verdicts, pronouncements of utter human helplessness. They spoke of the limit of earthly wisdom, the definitive boundary beyond which even the most brilliant minds and sophisticated technologies could not pass. In that moment, the need for something beyond human intervention, something divine, became a palpable, aching void. It was a stark reminder of our fragility, of how quickly the illusion of control can be stripped away, leaving us bare before the awesome, sometimes terrifying, mysteries of life and death. I called because, well, not for last rites just yet, Father Thomas clarified, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual pastoral strength. Not that they're not needed eventually, but, right now, they just need a presence. A quiet shepherd in the valley of the shadow of death. Someone to simply be with them. Will you come, Father? My answer was immediate, without a moment's hesitation. Of course, Father Thomas. I'll be there as soon as I can. The call ended, and the rectory quiet returned, but it was no longer the same. The peaceful hush had been infiltrated by the echo of a child's name, the cold shadow of medical impossibility, and the palpable ache of parents' grief. I pulled on my clerical collar, grabbed my stole, and found my car keys. The night air embraced me as I stepped out, cool and silent, in stark contrast to the burgeoning storm within my soul. As I drove through the sleeping city, the streetlights casting long, solitary shadows on the empty roads, I prayed. Not with any specific request? Not yet. My prayer was simply an opening, a radical surrender to the divine will. Lord, I whispered into the quiet of the car, she is yours. They are yours. I am yours. What would you ask of me in this place of profound suffering? How can I be your instrument, your vessel of grace, in this moment of utter human despair? The journey felt longer than it was, each mile a silent offering, a preparation for the somber sacredness of the ICU. I thought of Lily, a child I didn't know, yet already felt profoundly connected to, a lamb caught in the jaws of a predator no human hand could vanquish. I thought of her parents, Mark and Sarah, their names already etched into my consciousness, two souls adrift in an ocean of grief. The city lights blurred into streaks, a kaleidoscope of human endeavor and aspiration, all rendered meaningless by the imminent loss of one small, precious life. I understood Father Thomas's request perfectly. They didn't need a miracle worker tonight. They needed someone to stand with them at the precipice, to remind them, however subtly, that even in the face of absolute earthly defeat, God's love remains. To simply be there, a quiet, prayerful presence, a witness to their anguish, a silent testament to the enduring hope that flickers even in the darkest valleys. It was a call to shepherd, to walk into the deepest shadow, and trust that the Good Shepherd was already there, waiting. And as I pulled into the hospital parking lot, the imposing building looming under the stark glare of its floodlights, I knew that my quiet vigil, however small, was already a prayer in itself, a prayer that, perhaps, a greater hand than ours might intervene where all others had failed. I entered the hospital through the emergency room entrance, the fluorescent lights of the corridor a harsh assault after the soft glow of my car's dashboard. The air, thick with the scent of antiseptic and something vaguely metallic, felt like a physical weight. The hushed efficiency of the night staff, their footsteps muffled against the polished linoleum, created an atmosphere of somber urgency that felt profoundly at odds with the sleeping city I'd left behind. My clerical collar, usually a comfort, felt exposed, drawing glances that were a mixture of curiosity, respect, and often a flicker of fear, the unspoken acknowledgement of what my presence usually signified. I followed the labyrinthine signs towards the intensive care unit, each turn feeling like a descent into a deeper layer of human vulnerability. The silence intensified as I neared the ICU doors, broken only by the distant rhythmic beep of unseen machinery, a mechanical pulse in the heart of the hospital. These were the rooms where life hung by the most tenuous threads, where battles were fought not with swords, but with scalpels and medications and the relentless will of medical professionals, and sometimes where they were lost. The ICU waiting room was, as expected, a small, sterile box designed for function rather than comfort. No soft lamplight here, no plush chairs, just institutional beige walls and two worn vinyl couches pushed against the furthest wall. A muted television played silently in a corner, its flickering images of late-night news an ironic counterpoint to the profound, life-altering drama unfolding just beyond the double doors. And there they were, Lily's parents, Mark and Sarah. They sat on one of the couches, not facing each other, not even looking forward, but turned slightly away, as if trying to shrink into the very fabric of the cushions. They were a tableau of grief, rendered almost perfectly still by the sheer immensity of their sorrow. Sarah, her face pale and drawn, was small, almost swallowed by the cavernous couch. Her dark hair, usually so meticulously kept, was disheveled, falling across her face in strands that she made no effort to push away. Her hands, clutched tightly in her lap, held a rosary, its smooth, cool beads a stark contrast to the white of her knuckles. She wasn't praying it, not actively, at least not in the way one typically recites the Hail Marys. Her gaze was fixed on some invisible point on the wall, her eyes wide but utterly vacant, as if the light within them had been extinguished, leaving only a hollow echo. There was a profound, terrifying stillness about her, a silence that spoke not of peace, but of a soul utterly overwhelmed, unable to articulate the depth of its pain. It was the silence of a dam holding back an ocean of tears, a silence that threatened to break at any moment. Her faith, I saw immediately, was not gone, but it had been fractured, reduced to a desperate, unthinking grip on a familiar object, a fragile anchor in a storm she could not weather. Mark, by contrast, was a study in frustrated control. A tall man, probably in his late 40s, he possessed the lean, focused physique of someone who lived by logic and order. He was an engineer, I remembered the chaplain mentioning, a man accustomed to solving complex problems with precision and data. Now, that very framework seemed to be collapsing around him. He sat ramrod straight, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting restlessly around the sterile room as if searching for a flaw in the design, a mathematical error that could explain away this catastrophic reality. His hands were not clasped in prayer, but balled into fists resting on his knees, a visible sign of his internal struggle against a force he could not quantify, could not manipulate, could not fix. When I approached, he acknowledged me with a curt nod, his gaze quickly returning to the blank wall. There was an edge to his stillness, a barely contained anger simmering beneath the surface. He began to speak, not to me, but to the air, his voice clipped and strained, as if forcing the words out against an invisible resistance. The intracranial pressure was already too high. They explained it all. The blood vessels, the rupture, too deep, inoperable. He rattled off terms like a physician dictating a chart. Subarachnoid hemorrhage, cerebral edema, neurological deficits. His words were a shield, a bulwark of scientific fact against the terrifying emotional chaos that threatened to engulf him. His faith, I sensed, had been in the reliable mechanisms of the universe, in the predictable laws that governed his profession. Now, those laws had failed him, leaving him adrift in a sea of incomprehensible suffering. I offered a soft, "Good evening, Mark, Sarah. I'm Father Michael. Father Thomas called me." My voice felt like an intrusion, too loud in the oppressive quiet. Sarah merely blinked, her eyes still vacant. Mark's head snapped towards me. His eyes, though weary, held a spark of something almost accusatory. "Father," he said, the word emerging with a bitter taste. "They said there's nothing that can be done. Nothing. Scans, readings, surgical impossibility. We're talking about irreversible damage." He emphasized science, medicine, facts, as if challenging me, the man of faith, to contradict the incontrovertible. It was clear he viewed me as representing a domain that held no answers for the stark, brutal realities of the ICU. I did not attempt to offer platitudes, nor did I reach for theological explanations. There was no room for either in this raw, exposed moment. Instead, I simply pulled up one of the hard plastic chairs and sat down across from them, allowing my presence to speak where words would have been hollow. I understood Father Thomas's request perfectly. They didn't need a miracle worker tonight. They needed someone to stand with them at the precipice, to simply be there. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, punctuated only by the distant electronic symphony of the ICU. beeps and whirs, the hiss of oxygen, the soft, rhythmic sigh of ventilators, each sound a stark reminder of the fragile balance between life and oblivion. Outside, the world slept, but in this brightly lit antechamber of pain, time seemed to stretch and warp, each second laden with a terrible weight. I watched them, and I prayed, not with any specific words, but with an open heart, offering their suffering to a God who understands all suffering. I thought of Christ in Gethsemane, of his human anguish, his plea for the cup to pass, and his ultimate surrender, "Thy will be done." Sarah's silent, white-knuckled grip on her rosary, Mark's frustrated reliance on scientific terms, both were desperate attempts to make sense of the senseless, to grasp for control where there was none. My role, I knew, was not to provide facile comfort, but to acknowledge the profound injustice they felt, the existential bewilderment. How could a loving God allow a 7-year-old child, a pure, innocent soul, to suffer such a fate? This was the unspoken question hanging in the air, heavier than any silence. I didn't have an answer that would satisfy Mark's engineering mind, nor one that would mend Sarah's shattered heart. All I had was presence, a quiet offering of solidarity in their descent into despair. The ICU itself, just beyond those doors, felt like a sacred, yet terrifying, space. A place where the veil between life and death was infinitesimally thin, where human ingenuity pushed against the very boundaries of existence. The nurses and doctors moved with a quiet reverence, their faces etched with the fatigue that comes from constantly wrestling with life and death. They were dedicated, brilliant, and yet, ultimately, they were human, operating within the limits of their knowledge and skill. And those limits, for Lily, had apparently been reached. We began a vigil in that sterile room, a vigil born less of tangible hope and more of sheer, unadulterated desperation. It was a holding pattern, a dreadful waiting for an inevitable end. Mark's anger simmered, occasionally flaring into an agitated pacing, a restless energy that couldn't be contained. Sarah remained motionless, her eyes still fixed on nothing, a silent testament to a grief so profound it had momentarily frozen her very being. As the hours bled into one another, the initial shock began to give way to a deeper, more pervasive ache. Mark occasionally rubbed his temples, his gaze softening briefly as he looked towards the ICU doors, a fleeting moment where the engineer gave way to the heartbroken father. Sarah would sometimes trace the cross on her rosary beads, a ghost of a movement, a habit ingrained but not consciously enacted. I offered them water, a few quiet observations about the night, anything to break the suffocating silence. But their world had shrunk to the space between their child's bedside and their own suspended agony. I thought about the words of the psalmist, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." But here, in this valley of shadowed machines and failing bodies, it was hard to feel anything but fear, hard to discern the presence of the shepherd through the overwhelming sense of loss. My own faith, too, was quietly tested in these moments, not in the existence of God, but in the unfolding of His will, in the inscrutable mystery of suffering. How do we reconcile such innocence with such pain? I found myself returning to the words of St. Paul. "We do not know how to pray as we ought, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words." And so I sat, and I waited, and I offered my silent groaning alongside theirs, knowing that sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply to endure, to remain present, and to trust in a love that transcends even the darkest valley. This vigil, this shared desperation, this silent suffering, was the crucible in which something, perhaps, would one day be forged. For now, it was simply raw, unyielding pain, and the quiet, terrible waiting. The raw, unyielding pain, and the quiet, terrible waiting of that first night bled seamlessly into the first 24 hours, a disorienting blur of hushed conversations and the relentless, steady rhythm of machines. The ICU, with its sharp, clinical scent of disinfectant and the metallic tang of recycled air, became a crucible. Each blink of a monitor, each soft whir of a ventilator, each faint beep from a pump chipped away at the stillness that should have accompanied grief, replacing it instead with a ceaseless, unnerving symphony of technology, keeping a fragile life tethered to this side of eternity. I remember the way the fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder in the silence of my own thoughts, casting long, stark shadows that danced with the anxieties of our vigil. I moved between the waiting room and Lily's bedside, a silent sentinel. My own weariness became a dull ache in my bones, a constant companion to the ache in my spirit. I spoke little, for what words could I offer in the face of such overwhelming, inoperable suffering? Mark remained withdrawn, his face a mask of furious intellect wrestling with the incomprehensible. He spoke to the nurses and doctors in precise, technical terms, as if by dissecting the medical problem into its smallest components, he might yet find a solution, a flaw in the diagnosis, a path forward that science had overlooked. His anger, I sensed, was not directed at God, for I doubted he held much belief in a God who would allow such things, but rather at the fundamental unfairness of the universe, at the cruel betrayal of a world he had always believed to be governed by predictable laws. His hands, those hands that built and engineered, seemed useless now, clenched often into fists, impotent against the unseen enemy that had invaded his daughter's brain. Sarah, by contrast, had retreated into a profound, almost catatonic stillness. The rosary I had seen in her hands the night before was still there, but her fingers no longer moved over the beads. They simply clutched it, as if it were the last physical link to a hope she could no longer feel. Her eyes, perpetually red-rimmed and swollen, stared blankly at a middle distance, beyond the walls of the waiting room, beyond the reality of the ICU. She would occasionally ask, in a voice barely above a whisper, for an update on Lily, but the words seemed to escape her lips more out of habit than genuine expectation. Each negative report, each shake of a doctor's head, was absorbed into her already saturated grief, leaving no visible new wound, only deepening the existing chasm. She was a woman drowning, not in tears, but in a silent, suffocating sea of sorrow. I offered to pray with her, to read from the Psalms, but she would simply nod, her gaze unfocused, and I understood that sometimes even the most sacred words can feel hollow when the heart is utterly broken. My role, then, was simply to be there, a quiet, priestly presence in the face of desolation, offering a silent witness to their ordeal and to the inscrutable mystery of God's will. As the second day dawned, painting the sky outside with muted hues that seemed a cruel mockery of the life fading within, a new element entered our vigil. A few parishioners, having heard through the whispered channels of the church community, began to arrive. They were not an intrusive crowd, not a throng of well-meaning but overbearing visitors. Instead, they came in ones and twos, drifting quietly into the main waiting area, their faces etched with sympathy and concern. They did not immediately approach Mark or Sarah, sensing, perhaps, the fragile perimeter of their grief. They simply sat, finding chairs in the outer reaches of the room, their presence a quiet, supportive shield. I saw Mrs. Rodriguez, a woman whose profound faith was as unshakable as the granite foundations of our church, sitting with her hands clasped, her lips moving in silent prayer. I saw young Michael, a server from Sunday Mass, his youthful face pale with worry, clutching a prayer book. Their collective presence was like a gentle, unseen embrace, a testament to the communion of saints, living and praying for one another. I watched them for a while, these quiet soldiers of Christ, and a thought began to stir within me, a gentle prompting that felt almost like an imperative. We had prayed individually, in the privacy of our hearts, and I had offered my own quiet supplications, but there is a particular power in communal prayer, a strength drawn from the shared intention, a raising of voices and hearts that echoes the very structure of the church itself. I walked over to where Mark and Sarah sat, still in their huddle of sorrow. "Mark, Sarah," I began, my voice soft, trying not to startle them. "Some of our parishioners are here. They are praying for Lily." Mark merely grunted, his gaze fixed on a perpetually replaying news channel on a muted television screen across the room. The flickering images of distant crises seemed a morbid counterpoint to the intensely personal crisis unfolding within these walls. Sarah, however, slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, though still distant, held a flicker of something, perhaps a faint spark of recognition, or simply a weary acknowledgement. "I was thinking," I continued, "that perhaps we might pray a rosary together for Lily. Not a public spectacle, not if you don't wish it, but just a quiet gathering here, among those who love you and Lily, and who want to lift her up to Our Lady's intercession." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. "Father," he said, his voice clipped and strained, "with all due respect, what good will a rosary do? They've told us there's no hope, no surgical option, no medication, no logic to any of this. What can a string of beads accomplish against a ruptured aneurysm?" He turned away then, a dismissive wave of his hand, his eyes returning to the meaningless news report, seeking solace, perhaps, in the predictable chaos of the wider world. Anything but the unpredictable, terrifying chaos within his own. It was not anger at me, I understood, but the raw, unfiltered anguish of a rational mind confronted with the irrational, of a man whose faith had always been placed in the quantifiable and now found himself in a realm beyond measure. My gaze settled on Sarah. She looked at Mark for a long moment, a silent dialogue passing between husband and wife, a chasm of understanding growing between them even in their shared suffering. Then, slowly, she turned back to me, her grip tightening on her rosary. "Father," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing, barely audible above the hum of the hospital. "Yes, please, I don't know what else to do." It was not a plea for a miracle, not yet. It was something deeper, more elemental, a plea for solace, for companionship in her utter desolation, a desperate reach for the spiritual when the material world had failed so spectacularly. It was a faint echo of that profound, heartbreaking surrender I had seen in her on the previous night. I nodded, a gentle, reassuring smile on my face, though my heart ached for her. I walked over to the small group of parishioners, explaining Sarah's quiet agreement. Immediately, they began to gather, drawing their chairs closer, forming a small, irregular circle in the corner of the waiting room. We were a disparate group, a grieving mother, a skeptical father who remained stubbornly aloof, a priest, and a handful of faithful souls from varying walks of life, all united by the common thread of concern for a little girl and the shared language of prayer. Mark, true to his word, did not join us, but remained slumped on the couch, his back to us, a silent, almost defiant rejection of our spiritual endeavor. Yet, even in his resistance, I felt a glimmer of understanding, a recognition of his own pain that precluded participation. "We will pray the sorrowful mysteries," I announced, my voice low and clear, attempting to bring a sense of sacredness to the sterile, secular space. "For Lily, for Mark and Sarah, and for all who suffer." As I began the rosary, the familiar cadence of the prayers, "Our Father, who art in heaven," created an immediate shift in the atmosphere. The hum of the hospital, though still present, receded into the background, becoming a dull thrum beneath the rising tide of our collective invocation. We began with the first sorrowful mystery, the agony in the garden. I led the initial prayer, "Our Father, Hail Mary," and then allowed the others to take up the familiar responses. As we meditated on Christ's anguish in Gethsemane, his plea for the cup to pass, and his ultimate surrender, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours, be done," I felt a profound connection to the scene unfolding around us. Here, too, was an agony, a fervent desire for suffering to be averted, for a terrible fate to pass. Lily, innocent and vulnerable, lay in her hospital bed, a silent, unwitting participant in this profound human drama. Mark and Sarah, in their own way, were experiencing their Gethsemane, wrestling with a bitter cup that no parent should ever have to drink. I prayed for them, that they might find, as Christ did, the strength to utter their own "Thy will be done," even if their hearts shattered in the process. The image of Christ sweating blood under the olive trees was intensely vivid, mirroring the internal bleeding of a family facing the unimaginable. Then came the second sorrowful mystery, the scourging at the pillar. I pictured Christ's body, innocent yet subjected to brutal violence, and I thought of Lily, her tiny body, so fragile, so vulnerable, now assailed by an internal enemy, a silent, invisible violence that had erupted without warning. Her innocence made the suffering all the more poignant, all the more unjust in human eyes. The thought was not to compare Lily's suffering to Christ's, for that would be sacrilege, but to draw a thread of profound human suffering, innocently endured, into the embrace of divine compassion. The rhythmic repetition of the Hail Marys became a soothing balm, a steady heartbeat in the face of such raw pain, a prayer for healing, for relief, for divine intervention, however unfathomable. Next, the third sorrowful mystery, the crowning with thorns. This mystery, to me, always spoke of humiliation, of unjust mockery, of sovereignty unjustly denied. Here, in this sterile hospital, there was no physical crowning with thorns, but there was a subtle, insidious mockery in the situation itself. The mocking laughter of fate, perhaps, at human vulnerability. The silent taunts of a disease that strips away dignity and control. Mark, in his despair, might have felt a similar sting, his rational understanding of the world, his very sense of control, being crowned with the thorns of incomprehension and powerlessness. Sarah's vacant gaze, too, spoke of a spirit that felt stripped bare, exposed, almost mocked by the sheer, overwhelming nature of her grief. As the beads slipped through my fingers, each Hail Mary was a small act of defiance against the despair, a tiny offering of love and hope. The fourth sorrowful mystery, the carrying of the cross. This was a mystery that resonated deeply with the physical and emotional burden that Mark and Sarah were carrying. The crushing weight of impending loss, the arduous journey through the labyrinthine corridors of the hospital, the relentless passage of time, each second a small agony. Lily, too, was carrying her own cross, though she was unaware of its weight. The image of Christ stumbling, rising, and continuing his journey offered a profound metaphor for the human spirit's capacity to endure, to place one foot in front of the other, even when the path is unimaginable. The parishioners, their voices soft but unwavering, joined me, their collective prayer a gentle uplift for the family's heavy burden. It reminded me that we are never truly alone in our suffering. The mystical body of Christ bears the cross with us. Finally, the fifth sorrowful mystery, the crucifixion, the ultimate sacrifice, the moment of death, the apparent end of all hope, yet paradoxically, the genesis of resurrection. As we prayed this mystery, a profound stillness settled over our small group. The weight of Lily's precarious situation, the unspoken fear that this moment of prayer might be a prelude to her own passing, hung heavy in the air. Yet, in the very act of meditating on Christ's death, there was also the faint, almost imperceptible flicker of hope, the promise of new life that lies beyond the grave, the belief that even in the darkest valley, God's love remains. It was a plea for mercy, yes, but also a profound act of surrender, a recognition that human effort had reached its limit, and now all that remained was to cast our burdens upon the Lord. It was not a magical incantation, this rosary, no flash of light, no sudden dramatic intervention. Yet, as the final Amen was spoken, a discernible stillness had settled over our small group. It was not the stillness of resignation, but a quiet, shared surrender to the will of God, a collective plea for mercy, in a place where mercy seemed to have been forgotten. The air in the waiting room felt different, less heavy, as if the very act of prayer had stirred something, shifted an invisible veil. Sarah, her face still etched with sorrow, looked up, a soft, almost imperceptible easing around her eyes. Even Mark, though he had not turned around, seemed to be listening, his shoulders perhaps a fraction less rigid. The rosary had created a space, a spiritual anchor, in the turbulent sea of their grief. The vigil, this shared desperation, this silent suffering, was indeed the crucible, and in that moment, a flicker of something new, A fragile, nascent hope had been forged, not through understanding, but through the profound, shared mystery of prayer. The air in the waiting room had indeed felt different after the rosary, less heavy, as if the very act of collective prayer had stirred something, shifted an invisible veil. Sarah's face had shown a soft, almost imperceptible easing, and even Mark, though he had not turned, seemed to be listening, his shoulders perhaps a fraction less rigid. The rosary had created a space, a spiritual anchor, in the turbulent sea of their grief, a fragile, nascent hope forged not through understanding, but through the profound, shared mystery of prayer. Yet, such hopes, born in the quiet recesses of the soul, are often precarious, easily buffeted by the harsh realities that inevitably intrude. We were adrift in that spiritual calm for a time, a brief, precious interlude, but the ship of our shared apprehension still sailed towards an inevitable storm. The next few hours were marked by a hushed, almost funereal quiet that had settled over the ICU wing. The soft glow of the monitors and the rhythmic sighs of ventilators seemed to mock the stillness, charting lives with an indifferent precision. Each passing minute was a tightening coil, a deepening breath held in collective dread. I had returned to Lily's room, sitting beside her, reciting silent prayers, watching the tiny rise and fall of her chest, a movement now wholly orchestrated by a machine. Mark and Sarah had drifted back to the waiting room, their hands clasped, their gazes distant, lost in the private worlds of their fears. The flicker of hope from the rosary was indeed fragile, easily extinguished by the relentless march of time and the cold, unyielding pronouncements of medical science. I remember the distinct chill of that late hour on the third night. The hospital corridors, usually a hive of hushed activity, had grown largely silent, save for the occasional distant clang of a gurney or the low murmur of nurses at their station. Fatigue was a heavy cloak draped over us all. My own body ached from hours spent in uncomfortable chairs, but it was the weariness of the soul that weighed heaviest, the exhaustion of witnessing such raw, protracted suffering. I was not alone in this. I could see it in the eyes of the night staff, in the way their shoulders slumped slightly as they walked, in the almost imperceptible tremor of their hands as they adjusted equipment. This vigil was taking its toll on every soul present. It was just after 11 o'clock when Nurse Elena, the seasoned ICU veteran whose kind eyes I had come to trust, approached me with a quiet gravity that sent a shiver through me. Her face, usually a map of controlled professionalism, was etched with a profound sorrow, a silent empathy that needed no words. She didn't speak, merely nodded towards the waiting room, then gestured for me to follow. The message was clear, unspoken, yet utterly understood. The moment we had all dreaded had finally arrived. My heart quickened, a heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I rose, my joints stiff, and walked towards Mark and Sarah. They were still huddled on the vinyl couch, two figures sculpted from grief. Sarah was leaning against Mark, her eyes closed, while Mark stared blankly at the far wall, his hands still clasped, but now white-knuckled. Their fragile hope, so carefully nurtured, was about to be put to the ultimate test. "Mark, Sarah," I began, my voice a gentle murmur in the vast silence. They both stirred, their eyes slowly focusing on me, a dawning comprehension of what my presence, coupled with Elena's earlier signal, must mean. There was no need for elaborate explanation. The truth hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "Dr. Evans would like to speak with us," I finished, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah let out a small, wounded sound, like a gasp caught in her throat. She gripped Mark's arm, her fingers digging in. Mark, in turn, straightened, his jaw tightening, his engineering mind attempting one last, desperate attempt to compartmentalize, to rationalize the irrational. He nodded, a curt, almost defiant motion, as if preparing himself for a negotiation rather than a surrender. We followed Elena down a short, sterile corridor, to a small conference room that I had, thankfully, not yet had cause to enter. It was a utilitarian space, stripped of any warmth, designed for function over comfort. A long, laminate table dominated the center, surrounded by an array of ergonomically uninviting chairs. A large, flat-screen monitor hung on one wall, dark and imposing. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and something indefinable, something institutional and cold, like the very breath of objective truth. Dr. Evans was already there, standing at the head of the table. She was a woman of formidable intellect, her reputation as one of the country's leading neurosurgeons preceding her. But in this moment, she seemed less the towering medical professional and more a tired, compassionate human being carrying an immense burden. Her usually impeccably styled dark hair was slightly askew, and there were faint shadows beneath her eyes, betraying the long hours and the emotional toll of her work. Her demeanor, while professional, carried a visible weight of sorrow, a testament to the difficult conversation she was about to have. She looked up as we entered, her gaze sweeping over us, a profound sympathy softening the clinical precision of her features. "Please, sit," she said, her voice low and measured, devoid of any rush. We took seats, a solemn quartet, Mark and Sarah side by side, me beside them, and Elena taking a chair near the door, a silent, supportive presence. The silence that followed was absolute, punctuated only by the distant hum of the hospital's systems. It was the silence before a pronouncement, a judgment. Dr. Evans took a deep breath, her gaze moving from the monitor to Mark, then to Sarah, and finally, briefly, to me. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," she began, her voice gentle yet firm. "I wish I had better news for you. We've just reviewed Lily's latest scans, and the results are definitive." She paused, allowing her words to sink in, to resonate in the still air. Then, with a practiced but visibly painful motion, she activated the monitor. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of complex, intricate images, cross-sections of Lily's brain. She pointed to specific areas, her finger tracing paths on the screen, explaining in a language that, while medically precise, was delivered with a layperson's understanding in mind. "Here," she indicated a dark, shadowed region. "You can see the extent of the initial hemorrhage. The damage was catastrophic, as we discussed. Despite our most aggressive interventions to manage intracranial pressure, and despite the incredible efforts of the nursing staff, the brain tissue has been too severely compromised." She clicked to a new image, then another, showing a progression that was heartbreakingly clear. "The swelling, the pressure, it has taken an irreversible toll. We've been monitoring the brain activity very closely, as you know." Her voice, though unwavering, held a palpable sorrow. "Based on the latest EEG readings, and confirmed by these newest scans," she continued, her voice dropping almost to a whisper, "we are seeing a cessation of higher brain activity. The damage is simply too extensive. There is no measurable response to stimuli. The brainstem functions are critically impaired, and we anticipate they will cease entirely very soon." The words fell like stones, heavy and cold, dropping into a silent, bottomless pool. Each one was a lead weight, sinking, carrying with it every last vestige of hope we had desperately clung to. Definitive, catastrophic, irreversible, cessation, too extensive. These were not just medical terms, they were the executioner's pronouncements, the final nail in a coffin of parental dreams. Mark, the engineer, the man of logic and reason, had watched the scans intently, his face a mask of concentrated effort, as if he could will the images to change, to rearrange themselves into a different, more favorable pattern. He had clung to the data, the objective truth, believing that if he just understood enough, he could find the solution. But, as Dr. Evans uttered the final devastating words, his composure, meticulously constructed over days of agonizing vigil, began to fracture. His shoulders sagged, then his head bowed, slowly, heavily, until his chin rested on his chest. His scientific certainty, his reliance on reason and empirical evidence, was not just challenged, it was utterly annihilated. In its place was a gaping void, an abyss of pure anguish into which his entire world seemed to be collapsing. He slumped back in his chair. His hands, which had so confidently built and calculated, now trembled uncontrollably as he buried his face in them, his body racked by silent, convulsive shudders. The sound he made was not a cry, but a broken, guttural groan, a primal sound of a man utterly undone. Sarah, who had been holding her breath throughout Dr. Evans's explanation, let out a single, soul-shattering cry. It was not a scream of rage or a wail of despair, but a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak, ripped from the deepest recesses of a mother's soul. It was a sound that articulated every unspoken fear, every terror that had clawed at her heart since that first frantic call. Her body convulsed, a wave of grief so powerful it seemed to strip her of all strength. She crumpled forward, her head falling onto the table with a thud that echoed in the small, silent room. Her shoulders shook violently, her tears wetting the sterile laminate, hot rivulets carving paths down her pallid cheeks. She clutched at her chest, as if trying to hold her shattered heart together, gasping for breath, unable to draw enough air into her lungs. Dr. Evans watched them, her face a testament to the pain of delivering such news. Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. Her compassion was evident in the way she simply stood, offering a silent, dignified presence, allowing them their moment of devastating, unbridled grief. Elena, too, had averted her gaze, her hand rising instinctively to her mouth, her own sorrow palpable. I reached out, my hand hovering over Sarah's trembling shoulder, then gently coming to rest there. My thumb rubbed a small, comforting circle. Words were useless, utterly inadequate in the face of such profound sorrow. All that could be offered was presence, a silent witness to their desolation. My heart ached for them, for the unbearable weight of this moment. I prayed, not with words, but with an open heart, a plea for strength for these shattered parents, a plea for mercy for Lily, and for us all. The mystery of suffering, the inexplicable path of divine will, pressed down upon me with an almost physical force. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," Dr. Evans said finally, her voice softer, almost reverent, as she gave them a moment to regain some semblance of composure. Sarah's sobs had subsided into broken gasps, Mark's shudders into a rigid stillness. "I am so sorry. There is nothing more medicine can do for Lily. We have exhausted every possible treatment, every intervention known to science." She paused again, gathering her thoughts, preparing for the next equally devastating blow. "It is time," she continued, her voice heavy with the gravity of her words, "to discuss letting her go." The words hung in the air, a death knell, letting her go. It was a phrase cloaked in gentleness, but its meaning was stark, brutal. It meant withdrawing the machines that currently sustained her, allowing the fragile, flickering candle of Lily's life to finally extinguish. It meant surrendering to the inevitable, to the finality of death. In that moment, human effort had reached its absolute end. The brilliance of medical science, the tireless dedication of highly skilled professionals, the desperate prayers of a loving family, the quiet support of a community, all of it had culminated in this sterile room, in this heartbreaking pronouncement. All that was left was the raw, terrifying silence of impending loss. There were no more answers to seek, no more treatments to try, no more interventions to attempt. The path of human understanding, of human capability, had reached an insurmountable wall. We stood at the edge of an abyss, with nothing but the chilling wind of desolation whispering around us and a profound, terrifying emptiness ahead. It was a silence that spoke not of peace, but of utter, absolute abandonment. And in that terrifying silence, the question of what, if anything, remained, began to stir in the desolate landscape of our hearts. The raw, terrifying silence of impending loss hung heavy in the air, a shroud draped over Mark and Sarah's shattered hopes. Dr. Evans's words, delivered with a professional gentleness that only underscored their finality, still echoed in the small conference room. They had reached the absolute end of the human path. There was nowhere left to go, no further argument to make, no desperate plea that could alter the stark reality that had been laid bare before us. The brilliance of medical science, the tireless dedication of highly skilled professionals, the desperate prayers of a loving family, the quiet support of a community, all of it had culminated in this sterile room, in this heartbreaking pronouncement. All that was left was the raw, terrifying silence of impending loss. We stood at the edge of an abyss, with nothing but the chilling wind of desolation whispering around us and a profound, terrifying emptiness ahead. And in that terrifying silence, the question of what, if anything, remained, began to stir in the desolate landscape of our hearts. I placed a hand gently on Mark's shoulder, feeling the rigid tension beneath his shirt. Sarah, her face a mask of profound shock, seemed to have retreated inward, her gaze fixed on some unseen point in the sterile distance. The world, for them, had simply ceased to make sense. Logic, reason, love, all the pillars of their existence had crumbled, leaving only dust and desolation. "Come," I said softly, my voice perhaps a little hoarser than I intended. "Let us go back to Lily." The walk back to the ICU felt impossibly long, the corridor lights glaring down on our somber procession. Every step was heavy, weighted with unspoken grief. Mark stumbled once, catching himself on the wall, his broad shoulders slumped in utter defeat. Sarah moved with a strange, detached grace, as if her spirit had already begun to detach from the earthly sphere, leaving her body to navigate the final, painful paces. The air itself seemed thick with resignation, pressing in on us from every side, the sterile scent of antiseptic doing little to mask the spiritual decay that permeated the atmosphere. When we re-entered Lily's room, the artificial symphony of the machines that sustained her life seemed louder, more insistent, almost mocking in its relentless rhythm. The ventilator sighed, a mechanical breath inflating and deflating her small chest, a chilling counterpoint to the silence that had fallen upon us. The monitors blinked, displaying numbers and waveforms that, just an hour ago, had been grim indicators of decline, and were now mere recordings of a life in its final fading moments. The fluorescent lights cast a pallid glow over Lily's delicate features, making her skin appear almost translucent, like fine porcelain. Her hair, the color of spun gold, lay fanned out on the crisp white pillow, a vibrant splash of youthful color in an otherwise monochromatic scene of impending sorrow. She looked so utterly peaceful, so utterly untouched by the storm raging within us, that it was almost unbearable to behold. Mark, true to the summary, could not bear to look. He moved directly to the small, uncomfortable visitor's chair in the corner of the room, his back to the bed. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with silent, ragged sobs that racked his frame. The engineer, the man who believed in systems and solutions, was utterly undone. His intellectual fortress had been breached, his scientific certainty annihilated, leaving him exposed to the raw, untamed force of grief. It was a profound and terrible sight, the complete surrender of a strong man to a pain he could not possibly fathom, let alone control. He was utterly lost, adrift in an ocean of despair, where no map or calculation could guide him. I stood beside Sarah, watching her. For a long moment, she simply stood there, her gaze sweeping over the array of tubes and wires, the subtle rise and fall of her daughter's chest. There was a faint tremor in her lower lip, and her eyes, though still red-rimmed and swollen from countless tears, held a new, quiet intensity. The initial shock, the soul-shattering cry, the vacant despair, these seemed to have receded, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. It was not hope, not as the world understood it, not a desperate clinging to a medical possibility. It was something deeper, something ancient, something born in the crucible of absolute brokenness. It felt like the stripping away of all worldly illusion, leaving only the bedrock of the soul. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering for a moment above Lily's small, still one, before gently enclosing it. Her touch was feather-light, reverent, as if she were touching something sacred, already hallowed. And then, slowly, she turned her head, her gaze meeting mine. In her eyes, amidst the lingering shadow of grief, there was indeed a strange and sudden clarity, a quiet resolve that had not been there moments before. It was as if, Having plumbed the depths of human despair, she had found an unexpected spring, a source of strength that lay beyond all human understanding. "Father," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady, though still fragile, is there a saint for impossible causes?" My heart caught in my chest. The question, so simple, so direct, yet so profound in its implication, pierced through the sterile silence of the room. It was not a question born of denial, but of a quiet, desperate reaching. It was a recognition that human avenues had closed, but divine ones might still, somehow, remain. It was the first breath drawn after gasping for air in a suffocating void, a tiny spark in profound darkness. "Yes, Sarah," I replied, my own voice hushed, reverent. "There is St. Jude Thaddeus, the patron saint of hopeless cases, of lost causes." I spoke his name not as a charm, a superstitious incantation, but as an invocation, a whisper of ancient faith into the heart of modern despair, acknowledging the vast and terrifying chasm between our human limits and God's infinite power. Sarah nodded slowly, her grip on Lily's hand tightening almost imperceptibly. Will you pray with me to him, Father?" "Of course," I said, and stepped closer. Mark remained in the corner, oblivious to this quiet turning point, lost in his private storm. I placed my hand over Sarah's, encompassing both her and Lily's small hand within my own. Together, the three of us formed a fragile circle of faith, a tiny bastion against the encroaching darkness, a small island of belief against the vast ocean of scientific finality. We began the prayer, the familiar words of the novena to St. Jude Thaddeus, whispered in the hushed solemnity of the ICU room. "Most holy apostle, St. Jude, faithful servant and friend of Jesus, the Church honors and invokes you universally as the patron of hopeless cases, of things almost despaired of." As the words flowed from my lips, Sarah repeated them softly, her voice gaining a quiet strength with each phrase. It wasn't a demanding prayer, not a bargaining with God, not a desperate plea for him to change his mind. It was a prayer of pure, unadorned humility, an acknowledgement that they, as parents, as humans, had exhausted every last resource, every last ounce of their own strength. It was a surrender to the mystery that lay beyond the visible, an act of entrusting their deepest desire, their most profound agony, into hands far greater than their own. The air in the room, which had been so heavy with the scent of antiseptic and despair, seemed to lighten almost imperceptibly, as if a window had been opened to a faint celestial breeze, hinting at something beyond the confines of these sterile walls. We finished the prayer, and a silence settled, different from the terrifying emptiness of moments before. This was a silence imbued with a profound stillness, a space created not for human expectation, but for divine possibility. It was not empty, but resonant with a strange nascent presence. Then Sarah leaned over her daughter, her golden hair, now slightly disheveled, brushed against Lily's cheek. She closed her eyes, and a single tear, large and luminous, tracked a slow path down her temple, catching the fluorescent light before disappearing into her hairline. But this tear felt different. It was not the tear of pure, unadulterated grief I had seen before. It was a tear of acceptance, perhaps, or of a profound, heartbreaking letting go, a sacred libation offered from the deepest wellspring of her being. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, a sound meant only for her daughter, for me, and for the one who hears all prayers, even the silent ones of the heart. "Lord," she sobbed softly, the words catching in her throat, yet imbued with a fierce, absolute conviction. "She is yours. She has always been yours, my precious Lily. She is yours." Her hand, still clasped around Lily's, rose slightly, as if offering her child, a living sacrifice, back to the divine. It was a gesture of profound, heartbreaking faith, an act of unconditional love that transcended every human instinct to hold on, to fight, to control. It was the ultimate relinquishment, a pure act of trust in the face of what seemed like absolute loss. "Thy will be done," she finished, the ancient words echoing with a new, searing poignancy in that sterile room. It was not a casual recitation, but a sacred covenant, sealed with every fiber of her being, a total surrender of her own will to that of her Creator. My breath hitched. I had witnessed many acts of faith in my priestly life, heard countless prayers, offered comfort in myriad forms of suffering, but never before had I seen such a complete and total entrusting, a fiat of such raw, unvarnished love and surrender. In that moment, Sarah, a modern mother, echoed the eternal yes of Our Lady at the Annunciation. Mary, in her humility, had offered her very body, her future, her entire being to God's plan, saying, "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." Sarah, in her agony, was doing the same, offering her most beloved child, her heart's desire, to a God whose will was now, irrevocably, beyond her understanding or control. It was not a surrender born of weakness, but of an unimaginable strength. It was the strength of absolute faith, the profound courage to let go of every earthly attachment, every cherished dream, every hope tied to this world, and place it all, without reservation, into the hands of a loving God. It was an act of pure, selfless love, a love that trusted even when everything screamed that trust was foolish, even when the evidence of the senses pointed only to an unbearable void. It was the ultimate act of faith, the ultimate expression of a soul laying itself bare before the divine. I watched her, my own eyes blurring with unshed tears. This was the pinnacle of faith, not a demand for a miracle, but a complete acceptance of God's sovereignty, whatever His plan might be. It was the emptying of self, the ultimate, not my will, but yours. In that instant, the desperate prayer for a specific outcome had transformed into a profound act of worship, a recognition that Lily, and indeed all of us, belong to God, gifted to us for a time, but ultimately His. The quiet understanding that settled in the room then was not one of peace, not yet, but of a profound spiritual spaciousness. It was the space created when human striving ceases, when the finite gives way to the infinite, when the clamor of the world falls silent before the gentle whisper of divine providence. In that moment, amidst the cold, clinical reality of the ICU, a seed of faith, purified by fire, had been planted, deep and resolute, in the desolate landscape of a mother's heart. And I, as Father Michael, the humble shepherd, could only bear witness to its holy blossoming, a testament to the enduring, inexplicable power of unconditional love and absolute trust in the Lord. The quiet that settled after Sarah's profound surrender was unlike any I had experienced in my many years at the bedside of the dying. It wasn't the silence of despair, nor the hollow emptiness of relinquished hope. No, it was a silence woven with a different thread, a delicate, almost sacred fabric spun from pure trust. Her "Thy will be done" had not been a resignation to fate, but an offering, a gift placed gently into the hands of a loving God. It transformed the sterile ICU room, not physically, but spiritually, imbuing it with a palpable sense of grace. Mark, still wrestling with his own storm, had sat numbly, but even he seemed touched by the profound stillness his wife's faith had invoked. The cold, sterile air seemed to soften, the harsh, fluorescent light to dim slightly, as if in deference to the mystery unfolding. It was, indeed, a holy blossoming, a testament to the enduring, inexplicable power of unconditional love and absolute trust in the Lord. I recall pulling a hard-backed chair closer to the window, the city lights below blurring into soft streaks through my weary eyes. My own bones ached with the weight of the last few days, and my soul, too, was heavy with the quiet suffering I had witnessed. Sleep, light and fitful, eventually claimed me, but even in slumber, the soft murmur of the rosary beads, the rhythm of Ave Marias and Paternosters continued their silent litany within the chambers of my heart. The nurses, bless them, moved through the room with a reverence that belied the relentless demands of their profession. Their footsteps were whispers, their voices hushed, their empathy a tender balm in that place of sorrow. They understood, I think, that something profoundly sacred had transpired, even if they couldn't articulate it. The machines continued their steady hum. The ventilator breathed for Lily, a metronomic sigh that had become the mournful soundtrack to our vigil. Life, as science defined it, hung by the thinnest of threads, flickering faintly against the encroaching darkness. Just before the first blush of dawn began to paint the sky a soft, hopeful gray, a junior nurse named Maria, her face still smooth with youth, was making her rounds. She was meticulously checking the vitals, adjusting IV drips, her movements practiced and precise. I remember seeing her pause, her brow furrowing slightly, as she scanned the monitor displaying Lily's intracranial pressure. There, amidst the usual fluctuations, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker caught her eye. It was anomalous, a deviation from the grim stability that had defined Lily's readings for days. Maria leaned closer, her posture radiating a quiet doubt. Her initial thought, she would tell me later, was simply that the machine was malfunctioning, a common enough occurrence in the complex dance of medical technology. She tapped the screen lightly, as if to correct a digital hiccup, but the flicker persisted. Not just that, it seemed to stabilize, then subtly, almost imperceptibly, improve. Not a dramatic leap, not a sudden reversal, but a gentle upward drift, defying every expectation, every dire prognosis that had been delivered. Her eyes widened, a dawning incredulity warring with her professional skepticism. This wasn't a glitch, this was a change. With a sense of urgency that was hushed yet palpable, Maria left the room and quickly found her supervisor, Elena, a veteran ICU nurse, whose face bore the gentle etchings of countless nights spent comforting the suffering. Elena possessed a quiet authority, her judgment sharpened by decades of witnessing both the wonders and the tragedies of human biology. Maria, her voice barely above a whisper, explained what she was seeing, pointing to the monitor in Lily's room. Elena, her gaze steady and experienced, watched the readings for a long moment. She observed the tiny fluctuations, the subtle improvements that, individually, might be dismissed, but collectively began to form a pattern that simply should not be there. Intracranial pressure, which had been dangerously high and trending towards irreversible, was now showing faint signs of reduction. Other metabolic markers, too, subtly shifted away from their catastrophic trajectory. They ran through the usual checks for equipment error, recalibrating, re-verifying, but the data remained consistent, stubbornly defying logic. A quiet, almost fearful excitement began to stir between the two nurses. Elena, her jaw set, ordered a preliminary electroencephalogram, an EEG, to measure Lily's brain activity. The expectation, based on Dr. Evans's definitive assessment hours earlier, was a flat line, indicative of profound, irreversible damage. A flat line was the verdict of science. The machine whirred to life, tracing its delicate lines across the screen. Maria and Elena held their breath, their eyes fixed on the display. And then, there it was. Not a flat line. Not the chaotic static of a dying brain, but faint, rhythmic waves. Incredibly, impossibly, small, consistent undulations, like distant ripples on a still pond, appeared on the screen. Not strong, not fully formed, but undeniably there. They were the whispers of a mind that had been declared lost, the softest pulse of life where only the silence of death was expected. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes now wide with a mixture of shock and something akin to dawning wonder. She looked at Maria, and in that shared glance, a profound, unsettling truth began to settle. What they were witnessing was beyond the realm of medical explanation. It was impossible, by all scientific standards, yet it was undeniably happening. A quiet, inexplicable tide was turning, gently, miraculously, against the settled, unyielding verdict of science. The seed of faith, planted hours before in a mother's heart, had found soil in the very fabric of reality, and was beginning to send forth its first tender, impossible shoot. The dawning light felt different that morning in the ICU. The quiet, inexplicable tide, subtly turning, was now undeniable. A hushed, reverent energy hummed through the unit, a stark contrast to previous days. Nurses exchanged wide-eyed glances. Doctors, accustomed to definitive diagnoses, moved with uncharacteristic uncertainty, their brows furrowed in profound bewilderment. Returning to Lily's room after a brief prayer, my heart heavy with grief, yet pricked by a strange possibility, I saw Dr. Evans approach the nurse's station. Her posture of authority was subtly altered, disbelief etched around her keen eyes. I watched her confer with Elena, the veteran ICU nurse, whose emphatic gestures towards a monitor spoke volumes. Dr. Evans, after intense scrutiny, nodded, then ordered new brain scans. Her face, a mask of skepticism, betrayed a flicker of nascent wonder, challenging her medical certainty. The hour that followed was an eternity of impossible hope and medical protocol. I found myself in the chapel, the scent of old wood and beeswax a comforting anchor. I was not pleading for a miracle, but waiting with quiet attentiveness, ready to witness whatever profound mystery God intended. My rosary beads felt cool in my hand, my gaze fixed on the stained-glass wedding at Cana, where the ordinary became extraordinary. It was then Elena found me. Her usually calm presence was charged with frantic energy. Her eyes red-rimmed, glistening with unshed tears, she held a set of films, fresh from radiology, I knew, in trembling hands. She motioned for me to follow, her urgency a silent, compelling summons. We walked quickly, footsteps muffled, to a lighted view box in the empty corridor, its stark white glow illuminating the sterile surroundings. With a trembling hand, she clipped the old scan of Lily's brain onto the left side. The image was devastatingly familiar. The dark, chaotic shadow of the massive aneurysm, blurred lines of compromised tissue, undeniable, irreparable damage. A picture of medical finality. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, Elena slid the new film beside it. My gaze shifted, my breath caught. The damage was gone. Not healing, not scarred, but simply gone. The tissue, pristine, vascular structures perfect, an intricate, healthy map of a brain reborn. It was as if the catastrophic event had never occurred, erased from her very being. Elena turned to me, her face a canvas of disbelief and awe, tears streaming freely, heedless of professional decorum. Her voice was a raw, choked whisper, laden with the weight of something beyond human comprehension, words that have echoed in my memory. "Father," she sobbed, her hand reaching out as if seeking an anchor, "science cannot explain this. This is not medicine. I don't know what this is." In that moment, before those two contrasting images, one of despair, one of utter restoration, I felt God's presence so profoundly, so undeniably, it transcended all rational thought. It was a tangible, overwhelming wave of divine intervention, a merciful hand reaching into creation to mend what was broken. Elena's words, born of a lifetime in science, were not a surrender to superstition, but an honest acknowledgement of a truth that soared beyond human knowledge. It was the moment the impossible became undeniably real, painted in the stark black and white of a hospital film, an irrefutable testament to the boundless grace of our Lord. The scans pulsed, a silent testament to a truth too profound for words, too radiant for the sterile light of the corridor. Elena, her voice a choked whisper, had spoken the unspeakable, naming the unnameable. In that moment, watching her tears fall, I felt not triumph, but a holy awe, a humbling understanding of the vastness of God's mercy. I simply nodded, reaching out to gently squeeze her trembling hand, my own heart overflowing with a gratitude that threatened to crack it wide open. There were no explanations to be offered, only a quiet, reverent acceptance of the divine hand at work. 2 days later, the hospital room, once a tomb of whispered fears, buzzed with an entirely new kind of energy. It began subtly, an increase in spontaneous movement, a slight flutter of eyelids. Then Lily opened her eyes, not with a jolt or a dramatic awakening, but gently, as if waking from a long, peaceful sleep. Her gaze settled on her mother, and the first sound she made was not a cry of pain, but a small, clear voice, asking, "Mommy?" "Can I have some juice?" Sarah collapsed into Mark's arms, their combined tears now not of sorrow, but of an unimaginable joy. It was a moment etched forever in the annals of that ICU, a quiet explosion of life in a place accustomed to its extinguishing. The medical staff, ever professional, moved with a controlled disbelief. Dr. Evans, her initial skepticism replaced by a profound wonder, oversaw a battery of tests. Every reading was normal, every scan pristine. The damage, the aneurysm, the severe neurological deficits, they were simply gone. In Lily's chart, they wrote the clinical phrase, "spontaneous resolution of severe cerebral aneurysm," a label that attempted to categorize the utterly uncategorizable, a scientific acknowledgement of something that defied every scientific principle. For Mark and Sarah, life was irrevocably cleaved into a before and an after. The man of logic and reason, Mark, now spoke of grace with an engineer's precision, marveling at a design far grander than any he could conceive. Sarah, whose faith had been a flickering ember, now carried a quiet, radiant certainty, forged in the crucible of despair and redeemed by an act of impossible grace. Their suffering had led them not to bitterness, but to a profound, unshakable foundation of trust in God. I see them still, at Mass every Sunday, Lily often beside them, a vibrant, inquisitive child. Their faces are filled with a quiet, profound gratitude that needs no words, and I often think of Lily, a living, breathing testament to the fact that God's love operates on a plane far beyond our finite understanding. Sometimes, in the darkest corners of human despair, He chooses to pull back the veil, not to prove His existence, for faith needs no proof, but to remind us, with tender, undeniable clarity, that with Him, truly, all things are possible. The ICU nurse cried that day, and her tears, like mine, were a prayer, acknowledging the miraculous truth that had set us all free.